Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Caring for Converts, or as some people might regard it, a lonely road well travelled. This lonely road well travelled is the result of a report which has been produced by the New Muslims Project in collaboration with the University of Cambridge. The New Muslims Project is an organisation based here in the UK, in Leicester, which provides a range of services for converts to Islam across the whole of the UK. These services range from education and training to advice, counselling and guidance. In the report, we discussed a variety of areas to do with the convert Muslim and her narratives through her experiences and her journey as a Muslim, as a convert Muslim. And we've been discussing a variety of these issues in other programs. Today, we're going to look at marriage and the convert Muslim and how converts meet prospective partners and the etiquette of arranging marriages in a cross-cultural context. Of course, also the problems that arise from marriages within a cross-cultural context. Now, the discussion in the report itself and amongst the women who participated centred around the extent to which this social institution had lived up to the expectation of the participants, particularly in relation to Islamic ideals, which are frequently cited as one of the factors encouraging women to convert to Islam. This is about how Islam sees marriage and family life. According to Islamic belief, marriage is widely considered to constitute half one's expression of faith, the other half being piety. It was discussed that single convert women in Islam are often viewed with embarrassment by heritage Muslims and that they do not find a niche within the Islamic cultural structure. We also focused on culture, specifically on the problems of addressing different cultural expectations within marriage. And one of the issues, Ruqayya, that we addressed were these concepts of marriage of convenience and marriage of conviction. And where women had converted to Islam as a convenience to marriage, or women had been a Muslim before they got married, which was a marriage of conviction, and how these two differed. And there was a different feeling around the table about these two concepts.
I think we came to sort of a politically correct answer, didn't we?
Yes.
That there couldn't be any value judgments placed on any conversions, and it was between the individual and God, really.
Yes.
And that He would judge their sincerity and their intentions. But it's a commonly held stereotype that women convert to Islam in order to marry a Muslim man, when so many women find Islam before they actually get married. Although we did acknowledge within the report that many women do convert following marriage or in anticipation of a marriage, but it's not necessarily as simplistic as saying that they're converting for the sake of marriage alone, because Islam does allow for men to marry Ahl Kitab, people of the book, so that they can marry Jews and Christians. So, within that there is provision that women will not necessarily change their faith. Women do accept Islam for a variety of reasons within a marriage context. Some researchers have suggested that it's in order to kind of increase the bonds within a marriage and the cultural capital, the commonalities, the shared interests, the family ties. But often I think it's more profound than that women come to realise that there is something special about the way in which Islam is presented within their husband's behaviour or within the extended family that attracts them to Islam.
And in fact, it was clearly pointed out that in many cases, those women who do convert to Islam for a marriage of convenience actually, you know, sort of explore Islam when they settle into the marriage and become very strong and practicing Muslims. In fact, leaving their husbands in a very weak position of not quite adhering to the faith as strongly as they end up doing.
I think that does happen in some cases. In other cases, women may retain their own faith for years and years. There was one case within the report of a woman who converted to Islam after 27 years of marriage.
That's
so
right,
that hadn't been a sort of instantaneous conversion.
No.
But had been something that she'd obviously thought about deeply over a long period of time.
And in fact, I remember that story. Her husband said that he quietly made dua for her every day that she would eventually come to Islam. And it was actually through her children that she eventually came, sitting, talking with them, listening to them, discussing Islam, and eventually, you know, wanting to be part of that, you know, that spiritual path. But she was a wonderful person herself, in the sense that she looked after them and she made sure that they had a good Islamic upbringing and took care of the fact that they learned to read Quran and everything herself, which was very much in her favour as well.
I think within her marriage, though, you got the impression that both herself and her husband had both been very respectful to each other's faith.
Yes.
And that had enabled them to eventually come and share a common faith.
Yes. In fact, we did also talk about the fact that some women who converted to Islam for marriage and who progressed to becoming very strong Islamically themselves and taking on the Islamic spirituality in greater depth themselves, eventually ended up where their marriages broke down because their husbands didn't necessarily live up to the ideal that they had hoped he would live up to. And one of the little things that came out of the report was one participant said that eventually that particular woman ditched the man but kept Islam. And I think we felt that there was that was on the rise, actually, in some ways.
Yeah, I think that, you know, there are different experiences, because some women whose marriages fail for whatever reason, and they've converted either before or within the marriage, when the marriage does dissolve, they find it very difficult to separate Islam from their adverse experiences of the marriage. And it's not always as simple as retaining the faith, because some women find they're unable to separate what happened to them within the marriage from their experience of Islam.
Yes.
So it's not always quite as clear-cut, is it?
But, you know, at the same time, there were a lot of women around the table who had experienced very good marriages and were, you know, were incredibly happy within their marriages. And it was nice to see that there was a balance between the two in terms of positive images emanating from the group as well. And the people they were married to certainly had not only supported them but assisted them throughout their married life in learning more about Islam and in deepening their own sense of spirituality. There was one lady who was married for 44 years and had converted to Islam, yes, as you said, after 27 years of marriage, and her husband had supported her throughout in her Christian, upholding her Christian beliefs. But I think that for a lot of the women who were very active in the Muslim communities generally, they found that the adverse behavior of Muslim men had proven to be a test of the Islamic faith of a lot of the women converts who do get married. And I suppose, you know, there's that difficulty of cross-cultural marriages as well, because sometimes when people go into marriage and they come from a strong cultural background with a strong faith that supports that background, there tends to be a sense of superiority. And so the marriage starts off on an unequal footing, where there's a sense of superiority and a sense of inferiority. And any marriage that really starts off on a footing like that will have difficulties from the outset. So people have to understand that, you know, when they do get married to a convert, and in fact, you know, as I do, Ruqayya, in our office, you know, we are constantly receiving calls from people asking us about, you know, whether there's a convert woman that they want to get married to, or that we have, and they seem to think that we have got warehouses full of convert women of all shapes and sizes, so that we can just simply go in there and choose for them. The problem is that in many situations, they do not understand the background of the convert Muslim and the fact that she comes from a predominantly non-Muslim family, and that they will have to interact with that family in a way which is acceptable, which is respectful, which acknowledges that they are the parents of and the extended family of that person, and that they have their own religious celebrations and so on, and that you must, you know, sort of join in with in as far as you can. So it's very difficult when you have people wanting to marry converts but who have absolutely no idea of the background of that convert, or how that, you know, is going to impact on you. Yeah.
I think we should also mention the marriages that aren't cross-cultural, where converts marry other converts from the same culture, particularly in relation to the African and Caribbean community, where that seems a more prevalent situation. And there again, difficulties that are experienced within the marriage come from different sets of expectations in terms of the way Islam is internalised within those communities.
Yeah, it is difficult. African and Caribbean converts and marriage, I mean, you know, there were, you know, we obviously spent some time with the African Caribbean representation that were there. And those women came from a culture that's characterized by matriarchal structures, in which women predominantly as single parents are responsible for providing for the family and for the decision making within it. So for these African Caribbean women, the idea that marriage to a Muslim man would relieve them of that stressful, lonely and exhausting position was appealing. However, I think that they still experienced disappointments when they got in there. Because African Caribbean men, they said, were not able, for a variety of reasons, to live up to their wives' expectation of what constitutes a good husband. And I wondered, you know, sometimes, you know, when people convert to Islam, you wonder, you know, to what extent they are internalizing Islam.
Yeah. Well, there seems to be so much emphasis on externalities, and so little on the internal changes that people make within themselves. And I think that's where a lot of the problems stem, within the unrealised expectations. In terms of marriage.
Indeed. And I hope that we'll continue with this discussion and in this vein of thought in just after the break. So please join us then. Take care. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to our discussion on caring for converts. The narratives, this is based on a report, the narratives of female converts to Islam, which we have concluded is a lonely road, well travelled. And this lonely road is somehow much more distinctive for African Caribbean converts to Islam, at least particularly the ladies who contributed to this report in our grouping. And we were looking at African Caribbean converts and marriage, and the different understandings or upbringings that African Caribbean women have about marriage and so on, and how maybe African Caribbean men with whom they form marriages don't necessarily live up to the concepts of marriage within Islam. And some of the women said that their husbands proved unable to make the internal changes to their personalities necessary to be supportive and providing husbands, even while they in turn expected the women to be obedient and subservient. subservient. This frequently meant that following marriage to Muslim African Caribbean men, the women were in a similar situation to the position they had been in prior to marriage. That was that they had to be matriarchal, they had to provide for their family, be responsible, predominantly as single parents. And but with the additional burden of being expected to fulfill the role of an obedient wife. And I thought, you know, the women were quite outspoken, actually. The African Caribbean women who were part of that discussion were quite outspoken about that and about the disappointments that they experienced within their communities and with the marriages in their communities, and where sources of support often stem from other women in the community rather than the men. They had expectations of being cared for by a Muslim man, despite the role of the husband as a sole provider becoming less common. Their expectations of a caring husband who would provide for them and their children were not realized to the extent that they had hoped as Muslim women. I think one of the other things they were talking about the Nation of Islam and African American Islamic organizations, which incorporates a strong emphasis on black nationalism, was considered to be more effective in addressing the impact of racism, oppression and inequality affecting sectors of the African Caribbean communities, and was therefore better placed to serve the needs of African Caribbean heritage converts to Islam in Britain than any other UK organisation, which was interesting. And I think we also talk about the Brixton Mosque and how they had been instrumental in establishing a very strong African Caribbean community.
Yeah, within a particular interpretation of Islam, it's very ultra-conservative, Salafist approach.
Yes. But some of the ladies suggested that a lack of knowledge of issues facing the African Caribbean community converts may be due to the low profile of those communities, and the fact that, you know, the Muslim community has really not shown the interest and the concern for the African Caribbean community that it should, really. And because of that, perhaps, you know, it is internally suffering from some of the impact and the traumatic effects of what it is to be a Muslim living in the UK, in a society where we still have racism is endemic in the society as a whole. So it's very difficult for them. We also looked at the possibility of finding a suitable husband. Do you remember that conversation?
Yes, I do. Okay.
And, you know, who was responsible for supporting converts in finding a Muslim husband? And sometimes those people who purported to be supporting that convert were actually working on their own behalf and on behalf of friends of theirs who were maybe political refugees or asylum seekers into the country and had no status in terms of naturalization in the UK, and where a lot of converts were almost kind of duped into marriages where really what was being sought was a passport into the UK.
I think, though, the area of marriage sort of highlights the vulnerabilities of converts generally, especially in terms of their early conversion stages, where there's lots of pressure on converts to consider marriage, particularly in light of a hadith saying that marriage is half of faith, and there's a lot of pressure on people to perhaps consider potential partners that they perhaps otherwise wouldn't normally do so. I think with converts, though, there's always a problem of how introductions are made and how potential spouses are sort of scrutinised, because for the heritage Muslim community, although introductions are not always straightforward, there is a family background and family support system that can go some way to finding out about a potential partner's background, about their history, about their expectations. to see whether the sort of the two families will be harmonious. Whereas for a convert, there isn't that system, and so they're much more vulnerable, especially with the sort of the rise of internet dating and the possibility of meeting people on the internet, where there's even less scrutiny of who could be a suitable potential spouse than perhaps there was even through a system of formal introductions.
Yes.
So, you know, that's another kind of difficult area to negotiate.
Yeah. I mean, there seems to be generally within the Muslim community here in the UK a general lack of knowledge or information about the structures, the legal structures around marriage from the outset. And lots of people feel that, you know, they can just get married by having a religious blessing or a nikah, but they're not aware that without the civil marriage here in the UK, women really don't have a great deal of legal rights. And which is kind of really strange, because in Muslim countries across the entire world, there is a distinct difference between the nikah and registering your marriage. And in most Muslim countries that I'm aware of, Egypt, Pakistan, Jordan, all of these places, you have your nikah, but you also have your marriage registered at the court or in the county court or whatever it is. And by some, you know, fluke of, you know, misunderstanding or I don't know what kind of dubious kind of behaviour goes on here in the UK, but a lot of Muslims have this resistance to having the nikah and then going to register your marriage in the proper systematic way. While they accept that it's okay to do that in their country of origin, which is predominantly Muslim country, they resent it here in the UK, and in fact a great many Muslims, and converts included, end up having this, you know, plastic marriage in a sense. It's just it's an nikah, but it doesn't have any you know, proper format within the legal prescriptions here in the UK, and where the children are unrecognised as well as children within a proper legalised marriage.
Yeah, it can be quite problematic for women, particularly in terms of them not knowing enough about the history of the person that they're marrying, and that they could already be married in another country.
Absolutely.
Obviously, if they then attempted to have a civil marriage in this country, they'd be committing bigamy under British law. But by just adhering to a nikah and not going for a civil ceremony, it kind of frees them of that likelihood of that happening.
Yes. But it's hugely problematic for the convert women. And it was also suggested that converts should ensure that they have a written marriage contract. In many situations, this doesn't happen. In fact, in many situations, they don't even have a certificate of the nikah marriage which has taken place wherever it may have taken place, whether that is in a mosque that doesn't provide it, or you know, in somebody's sitting room. And you know, by doing things like this, and often convert women are duped into doing things like this under the guise that this is the way it should be done, because this Muslim partner or spouse is suggesting that this is how it's done. Don't worry, I know all about it. You don't know really anything because you're a convert. What would you know? So, you know, just go along with what I do and then we'll be fine. And actually, they do often find themselves in pretty scary positions without any kind of prenuptial agreements or, you know, where there's no contracts, certificates or anything to suggest it. And, you know, I've often had marriages where people have gotten married and they've had no witnesses to the marriage, at least none that they knew of.
Yes.
The witnesses to the marriage have been just strangers that they met that day in the mosque, or were sitting outside on the wall outside the mosque and were just brought in to act as witnesses for that particular situation. And then, of course, when the marriage breaks down, there's no sight of the witnesses, they can't be found, there's no trace of them, and so on and so forth. So it is a very unfortunate situation to be in. And I think it's important for us as converts, and even through our work at the New Muslims Project, that we try to identify what is acceptable in terms of a recognized marriage, not only Islamically, but here in the UK from a legal perspective. And of course, the other problem is that converts to Islam, for some reason, I can't imagine why, but they're almost seen as some kind of loose cannon in the society, you know. They must be married immediately. So everybody rushes around the mosque and around the community trying to find a prospective partner for this convert, when actually the convert doesn't have enough confidence in their knowledge of Islam, in their ability to discern between culture and religion and what's happening just generally in the society and so on, in the Muslim community, and are not able to make those choices, really, because they don't have enough knowledge. Yeah. So pre-marriage counselling would also assist converts to develop their self-knowledge and awareness when making their choice of partner. And again, you know, it's about the people who are presenting these potential marriage partners. What is their particular agenda, you know, in relation to this particular possible spouse, and the convert of whom they have very little knowledge as well.
Yeah. I think that we came across that during the report, though, particularly for older women seeking partners. It was particularly problematic in terms of being introduced to suitable people. There were a number of people who'd had unpleasant experiences in terms of marrying men that were much younger than themselves, and then finding that the families of origin had got other alternatives in terms of wives for these particular men. And then they just seem to be open to exploitation, really, and there really needs to be some sort of system whereby people can be introduced.
Indeed.
And there's some kind of investigation into their suitability or background.
Inshallah. Yeah. Okay, and that's where I'm afraid we have to leave it today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being with us today for this programme about marriage and converts to Islam. Please do join us again in our next programme. Take care until then. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.